Hello, this is Rick doing the first podcast for 2021. I'm going to try to keep these, 20, 25 minutes. But the nice thing about the podcast on the other hand is it's without a schedule. And so often if you ever saw the Dilbert cartoons, the main point of the Dilbert cartoon was the point of view of a working engineer and the point of view of a manager are opposite and can never be reconciled. And that's one of the intros that I use when I talk about management, because if that is really true, I mean, the whole job of management is for that not to be true. And in a way, that same paradigm could apply just as comically or just as well in teaching, that the point of view of the teacher and the point of view of the student are somewhat opposite. And I also kind of rally against that. And but on the other hand, I mean, there's some truth in it. I mean, we have different jobs to do. And for me, I really like the podcast because I can go off on tangents. And I know that students have sometimes criticized me for doing that. On the other hand, later on, people say that those were the most valuable part of the class because it's a part of the class that you don't, not going to pick up on the job, not going to pick up in a book. And to me, they're not really tangents. They were the things that I learned when I was actually out doing it. So anyway, I'm going to jump into what's really the rest of the introduction that I didn't do in class. The podcast after this podcast, we're actually going to jump into the first of the little niche topics, but a little orienting about where I'm coming from. The little satellite shown on this introductory slide, Design of Space Systems version 2021, the first slide, really dates itself because it's got that 1.4 megabyte semi-hard Sony disc on it, which I think nowadays many people don't even know how big they are. So, I mean, I don't really know how big it is. There's a tiny little antenna on the upper side of the spacecraft. Well, just to give you kind of an idea of the size of that box, it's about 1.5 inches high. That white panel is about 1.5 inches high. So that was considered pretty radical back in the early 90s. And that was a complete functioning satellite with a star tracker, which is that big optical baffle on it. And that was kind of, where I was. I was trying to validate the use of small satellites. Small satellites have been around. They were the first satellites because we didn't know how to launch anything bigger. And they were very quickly, overtaken by much bigger, much more complex satellites and all the, attention that was paid to them. And the small satellites were relegated to being something that amateur radio operators were doing for, hobby type stuff. And that's how I got into it. When I was an undergraduate at Brown, I joined AMSAT. I'd been a ham radio operator since I was very little. And I got intoxicated with the idea that we could do more with them. And that really drove a lot of my career. Okay, on to the second slide. Instead of saying, design of space systems, my experience, in space, having worked in it since I was 20 and now I'm 66. And, not that I haven't done a couple other things with my life in the meantime, but I've been, sitting on the eggs for 46 years now. And, my own observation about it is, in a way, what we're all doing out here is searching for extraterrestrials, looking for something that we can offer to do in space that somebody will actually want to pay for. I mean, that's in a way the story of engineering. We can engineer a lot of things. The question is, what's anybody willing to pay for it? And anybody could be, people who want to play video games. It could be, senators. And, it could be military people who want to, intimidate or win wars or, whatever the story is. Or it can be people, I'm sort of hoping, can be normal people who want to entertain themselves or want to self-actualize or want to do something with their life. So, that is satisfying to them. And in a sense, learning to be an aerospace engineer is in itself an extraterrestrial utility. It's a super fun thing to do. When I was at Brown, I got into space through aeronautics, and I went to Stanford to study aeronautics, as I mentioned. And in order to prepare myself for the career I was dying to have as an airline pilot, I was teaching flying at the Fall River Airport and then later at the Providence Green Airport. And I was the flight instructor for the Brown Flying Club, which I actually inherited. There was one here when I got here. And I was the only undergraduate with a, license to teach flying, and I was super glad to do that. And I did a bunch of other flying jobs out at the airport, flying freight and, just doing the things that young pilots do to try to build up hours and get experience. And, it's very expensive to fly. And a lot of students would only learn to fly in order to learn to fly, and they really never did it again afterwards, because the cost, even to just keep yourself in shape, you really should go to the airport every couple of weeks and at least fly for an hour. And an hour, I don't know what it costs nowadays. I know that back then it was costing $20, $25, and that was a long time ago. That was 50 years ago, 45 years ago. So it's probably several $100s an hour now, and for a student that's a lot of money. And people would say to me, look, is it pay to learn to fly? If I can't afford to, do it ever again, I'm just going to, take everything I earned over the summer and spend it to learn to fly. And I used to say to people, look, if you take 10 hours of flying instruction and you solo the airplane, you're not allowed to just take the airplane and go any place you want, but the instructor signs your logbook and you taxi out on your own. Me in this case, he waits on the ground and watches you. You taxi, call up the tower and ask permission to taxi, drive the plane to the end of the runway, and get permission to take off and fly around the airport. Essentially, you make a 360 degree loop around the airport and re-land. And that is super cool. I still remember, when I first did that, and there was nobody in the airplane but me. And there you are, 1,000 feet above the ground, and you have this feeling like, what the hell am I doing over here? It's very exciting. And learning how to engineer satellites, to me, was very exciting. Just how do those things work out there? How do they remain autonomous? How do we decide what orbit they get into? How do we communicate with them? I was just like, very loaded with questions about how we do that. And I guess it was more mysterious to me than airplanes. And, I had an employee in my company, Pat, who was one of the vice presidents and an excellent space engineer. And she's now, got a big job with a company in Colorado. And about 10 years younger than me. And Pat left the company to build software. She was quite good at that. And she did well in that and had a much better paying job than she had in the space world. And called me up one day and said, Rick, I'd like to come back to the company and go back to running space programs. So, we made it work, and she came back. And, it happens quite often. Some of your best employees have left and come back. And so we were talking about it one day, and she said, look, it was fun. It was challenging. I liked the people, very creative and, super bright group of people, because a lot of really smart people go into software development. And she said, but having been the manager of a program who system architected the program and then going to Kennedy Space Center and spending all night waiting for the launch and seeing that huge rocket on the launching pad finally ignite, and your payload is that 1% of mass, or 1% of 1% if you're at piggyback, and you see that thing launch into space with the Navy and the Air Force and the tracking system and all the big screens. And finally, you see from telemetry that the rocket has released your satellite so that it's alone in orbit someplace, generally over the Indian Ocean or something like that. And then it comes around to the west coast of the United States, and we pick up the first signal from it. And she said, there's nothing exciting like that in the software world. That is just, once you've done that, you want to do it again. It's really fun. And the two things were a little bit parallel in my mind. So we want to do it. Right? And then we have to find a way to convince people to pay us to do what we like to do. So I guess we're all just kind of, Peter Pan complex or something like that. So besides this course, after I started teaching this course at Brown, I created the Crossing the Space Chasm course, which is a first-year seminar, 012B. And the thesis of that course is a little bit of the reflection of the way I see space, which is that it remains, 50 plus years into it, a kind of a niche, kind of considered interesting. To me, anything that's interesting is not mainstream. If it's interesting, it's because it's out of the ordinary. And by definition, if it's out of the ordinary, it's not in the mainstream. And my thing in life, and I think in a large extent Brown Space Engineering's thing in life, is to bring space down to earth, to use that ridiculous cliche. It's not totally ridiculous, but it hurts my ears a little bit because I hear it so much. It's such a kind of cliche in the space world. But I always say cliches are cliches because they're useful. That's why, we use them, because they do describe very well an emotion or a thought or a concept. And bringing space down to earth, as trite as it may be, is a good idea. Why do not more people get to have that experience and get to self-actualize, get whatever the hell they want out of space? Entertainment, art, science, just fooling around. We do that in robotics. Every robot doesn't have to weld car bodies. Kids build robots, in high school and college because it's fun. And that's a perfectly valid reason to do anything. And for some reason in the space world, we act like, well, if it's not the best world-class science in the world, we can't get behind it. And it's like, why not? Why can't we just do things because they're fun to do? And in fact, I think we're all doing things because they're fun to do anyway, and we're just trying to disguise it as being super serious. I mean, everything that happens in space so far, we're doing because we wanted to do it in some sense. It's not that we're putting, produce on the table of Americans very much. And to a certain extent, you could say, well, we're making weather forecasts. I mean, going to an asteroid, picking up a couple of grams of asteroid material, flying them back is super hard. And it's super expensive, like billions of dollars. And what's it doing for us? It's just satisfying our curiosity. It's something we want to do, and therefore we're doing it. If we didn't want to do it, if it wasn't interesting, we wouldn't do it. And nobody on Earth would say, oh man, I had to go hungry tonight because we didn't bring 2 grams of asteroid back. Shoot. So it's pretty arbitrary what we do. And, I used to rail against that also. Now I kind of like it. I think we should go with that. I think we should take advantage of that and make space a lot more than it's been so far. These are things that I use in my Crossing the Chasm class that cross the chasm, which is to say they went from total fantasy land to everyday reality, right? The cell phone, which is what those are, not smartphones, the flip phone particularly, first appeared, on Star Trek as a science fiction device that nobody thought would ever be real. I mean, that in those days, I was like in elementary school, and my mother had a telephone on the wall in the kitchen, and she got my father to go to Radio Shack and buy her an extra long curly Q cable so that she could cook dinner and wash dishes and, do whatever she wanted to do in the kitchen while, sit and, sort things or just do things with her hands. And I have the same habit. I tend to sort things or fold laundry or wash the dishes while I'm talking on the phone. Just a little bit rude. But in those days, that was how you did it. And you saw Star Trek on TV and nobody thought, oh, I'm going to have one of those, someday. No, it was science fiction. And now it exists. The automobile was science fiction for many, many years. And, weird people were building steam, driven automobiles. Nobody thought that was ever going to be real. It was just, curiosity of the 17th century. And of course, airplanes, we all know the story of airplanes. When the Wright brothers flew them, it wasn't that the world said, wow, this changes everything. No, they thought, a couple of bicycle mechanics did something kind of to get into the Guinness Book of World Records, right? And of course, virtual reality and video games and all that. Even when I was first working, in the space industry, we had mini mainframes and stuff like that. And we played Chutes and Ladders and a couple of other games that basically you could do with just an ASCII interface, where the ladder rungs were horizontal lines and, your creatures going up them were asterisks. And the idea that we would be where we are today was, all science fiction. On the other hand, one of the films that made a big impression on me as a little kid was 2001: A Space Odyssey. One of the things that's been criticized about Arthur Clarke is that nothing that he predicted, very little of what he predicted, happened. We don't have a Hilton hotel in a gigantic orbiting space station, Earth orbiting space station, that's a spoke and a radius, where the radius turns to create a sort of centripetal acceleration that mimics gravity. We don't have interplanetary missions with humans on board, not to mention that they're not in cryogenic storage and the mission is managed by artificial intelligence. So, which is, the picture on the upper right was the critical point in the film where the humans begin disassembling the computer to disable it. And I kind of ask why not? Why didn't those things happen? One thing about Arthur Clarke, he had a degree in space engineering, more on the electrical side. But, he had a master's degree that he did in England, and he didn't set out in life to be a science fiction writer. He set out in life to be an engineer. And he, you may know that he's credited with having invented, though that's not quite accurate, the idea of geosynchronous communication satellites. The idea that was first actually written in a paper in the 1800s by a Russian mathematician, that there's a certain height of an orbit, about 40,000 kilometers, 39-something thousand kilometers, that orbits the Earth with an orbital period exactly equal to the Earth's rotational period, right? And therefore, the satellite in orbit above the equator with the same rotation speed as the Earth will appear to be stationary over the equator. Arthur Clarke revived that idea 60 years later and said, and you could put a Gigundai antenna on that thing, and you would have a radio relay station in space that you could just point your antenna at, and you could hear signals 24/7, bounced over the horizon, to the other side of the Earth, almost 180 degrees around the Earth, like from Washington to London to Madrid and Athens and all that kind of thing. And going in the opposite direction, you could go to Tokyo and to Sydney and all those other places out in the Western Pacific. That idea that he wrote up was laughed at in the 40s. And it was part of the reason that he went into science fiction, was to make the point. He always said to me, the trouble with science fiction is it's 95% fiction. And he said, I don't like that. I don't write science fiction to be 95% fiction. I want mine to be 95% fact, and the fiction to be just that we haven't done it yet. And if you read his stuff with that in mind, you realize that the guy was serious. He wasn't just like fantasizing to sell books. He was serious that these things could happen and should happen, and he was trying to lead us by the nose to make them happen, but he was just not taken seriously, treated as a fictional character. But this was part of my thesis, that space didn't cross the chasm. It didn't become a part of everyday life. We get in an airplane and we fly to another city, and in 1908, that would have been considered science fiction. But we don't get in a rocket routinely and fly to a Hilton in low Earth orbit for a meeting. That would be space crossing the chasm. It sounds totally fanciful, but I think in some century it will not be fanciful. And I think a lot of people, space people now, have that idea in mind, that sooner or later we're going to get there. Okay, so, start here. I actually wrote that to myself many years ago to remind myself where I finished the slides, but I actually left it because I started here. Those were the littlest satellite that's right almost in front of our noses, on the little platform, was built by EMSAT USA, and I was part of the team that built it. And that was in France. The integration was sent to France, and that was integrated in Kourou, and it was launched by Ariane. This was the original Ariane rocket. And the main payload was a payload called SPOT, which was a remote sensing satellite that took pictures of the Earth. So that's the big box on top of us with all the gold foil on it. The other satellites, actually EMSAT built a few, and you can see there's a couple of copies. And then there's a bigger black box on the platform that was built by the University of Surrey. And my company and Surrey became the two big protagonists of microsatellites. We were a little bit in competition, but not really all that much, because we were serving, two different markets. We were also kind of in competition in philosophy. But that quite often happens in the tech world. I mean, to compare ourselves to the giants, there's a few operating systems out there, the big two being, the Apple OS and Microsoft, let's say for PCs, not talking about phones, but even in the world of phones. I mean, there's Android and there's Apple, and then there's a bunch of other ones. And in the space world, there was Surrey and there was us, and there were a bunch of other ones. But we were kind of the two guys who were, kind of saying, well, you could do this and you could do that. And frankly, we never got along very well. I would go there and give lectures, and I don't know, Martin was always kind of dismissive of me as being kind of, unsophisticated, I guess you would call it. And I was sort of critical of him because he was very technically sophisticated, but a little bit the professor, he was just a little too rigid, and he didn't open up he just saw a little satellite as a little version of a big satellite. I saw a little satellite as opening up a different way of doing business in space and a different set of missions that you could do in space. So anyway, what you're looking at on the left-hand side is the fairing that protects the payload from the atmosphere in the early stages of flight, up to about 100,000. If I can get these numbers right, it's always between the kilometers and the meters, not up to 100 kilometers, up to where the Q, the air 1/2 mv squared, becomes small. And as I recall, it's around 300,000 feet, so that would be about 100,000 meters, 360,000 feet, something like that, where the fairing comes off. So the fairing is the big black structure on the right. You're seeing half of it, and then there's another half of it. And, the typical big satellite. And on the right is that rocket, the ESA, European Space Agency, Ariane rocket, launching off the pad. I didn't make these pictures because I didn't go to the launch site. I think I was like in college or something when this happened. But a couple of these guys, the AMSAT guys, yeah, they went. They bolted that thing onto the plate. I so wanted to do that, and later in life, I got to do it. Okay, I made one biographical slide of myself, a little bit, disorganized. So this is the next slide with a picture of me when I got to Brown. So that's what I looked like back then. But what's on this page really? A couple pictures of some of the books that I wrote, and what people say about me in my bio. I mostly wrote those books to convince people that space didn't have to be so hard. And then I worked on space mission design, SMAD, the book that I've uploaded for you. For a very funny reason. I was anti the whole thing. I mean, I was much more, warlike when I was younger, I guess, because it was just a book about, another book about satellite design. Does the world really need another one? And I went to Jim Wirtz, the guy who was the editor and was pulling this whole massive thing together. I should have had more respect for the guy, and actually we became very friendly, like often happens. And I said to him, look, what you're writing about is 1960s space. And it's now 1990s, 30 years have gone by, the world has changed. And, I don't want to participate in the book unless you're going to have some chapters on small satellites and what we can do with small satellites. And so, I talked myself into a job, and I ended up having to write these chapters. And it's a serious book, and it was very painful to do that. But it turned out to be important, I was used to putting my voice out kind of like in my own webcast, you know what I mean? And this way I got into a mainstream, forum where a major mainstream important book sponsored by the Air Force on satellite design included microsatellite technology. That was the first recognition we ever had that it was actually valid and not just a toy. So it started off in kind of a me snubbing him and him snubbing me, but it actually turned out to be, it's kind of like the song Good Intentions. If you have good intentions and you work at it, things will tend to work out. I mean, I wasn't really at war with Martin or at war with SMAD, but I had a point of view, and I was frustrated that people were dismissing me. And I saw that in Arthur Clarke when I first met him, that, as nice as a guy and as successful as he is, he still laughs about the fact that people think he's kidding. So, as it shows at the bottom here, I teach at Brown and I teach at La Sapienza, which is a cool place to teach. It's the largest university in Europe. And we have about 165,000 students enrolled on campuses spread all over the greater Rome area. It's also called Roma 1. And then there's a Roma 2 and a Roma 3. So you can imagine how many students are in Rome. A lot with those three. And there's a lot of private universities here. I wouldn't say Rome is much of a university town. It's kind of a hodgepodge of a million things. But we have, 100 students a year going through the space architecture class here. You know, it's a big university, and they have many, many niche, specialties like that. So this was the book I didn't write, and I don't remember if I mentioned this in class, but I have a friend who I worked with at the space agency here, Marcello Spagnuolo, and we actually kind of parted ways on the book over this cover. Not because the cover was so important, but because my idea of where to go with the book and his idea of where to go with the book were a little different. I wanted to be more in your face because I'm a more in your face person. I have more of an American, challenge authority point of view, whereas Marcello is much more, go along to get along person, and he wanted to write an interesting book, but not a very controversial book. And we just had different approaches, and I had a lot of other projects to do. And he wrote the book on his own. We had already done one book together, but I didn't want to spend too many heartbeats writing a kind of a dry textbook on the geopolitical history of space. History of space is more his kind of thing than my kind of thing anyway. But, you look at that picture. What's in that picture? 3 things. The flag, the moon, and the guy. It was a guy. Now we're putting a girl. But at the time, what did John Kennedy say? He didn't say to put a person on the moon. He said to put a man on the moon. So, that was the 60s that I definitely grew up in. So what's the most important thing in that picture? It's not the moon. You don't have to put a person on the moon. We'd been on the moon, and the Russians had really been on the moon. So it wasn't the moon that was such a breakthrough. And it wasn't really the astronaut that was such a breakthrough. It was, in a way, very risky to put a person on the surface of the moon because they're trapped in the gravitational well of the moon. If the rocket doesn't fire, they're going to be stranded there and die. And that would not look good for NASA, for the President of the United States, for nobody. People don't know why Nixon canceled Apollo. Apollo was like fantastic, right? We were putting people on the moon routinely and driving cars around and picking up rocks. I understand completely why he stopped it. We had done it. The first time, it's worth risking your life. Maybe the second time, to prove that the first time wasn't a fluke. But if you keep rolling the dice with the technology we had in 1969, 1970, sooner or later, something terrible is going to happen, which it almost did on Apollo 13. And I think Nixon he was a super smart politician. And okay, he had his problems, but I never abandoned Nixon totally. The guy was super smart. He was a little strange, but he was super smart, and he saw, where this could go. As kind of a chess player. So anyway, I don't blast him for doing that. I think people, it pays to get into their shoes, and keeping going with that had very little upside, and the potential downside was just like an infinite black hole. And so, but given the chance between negative infinity and +1, you're going to end up on the negative side of the number line. And he did. And, the faulting was the lack of imagination. Okay, what do we do next? How do we keep the momentum going? Instead, NASA kind of shut down. But anyway, those are geopolitical stories. But to me, the most important part of this picture is a flag of China that I pasted on there, quote unquote photoshopped, as they say here in Italy. It's one English word that you hear a lot around here, meaning fake, right? But the point is, why did we do Apollo? To put the American flag on the moon. That was what it was all about. Who paid for it? A bunch of scientists didn't pay for it who wanted to get some rocks back. It was paid for by the government. And Saturn V was a need of the Department of Defense. And like I said in class, it was well wrapped into a super cool, it was a very smart deal. If you're going to spend $1 trillion, you need to get everybody on board. And they got the military on board. They got the civilian science teams on board. They got educational people on board. Eventually, it didn't happen right away. Eventually, the American public became proud of it. And the whole world was on board. By the time it all got done, it wasn't that way like everything. While you're baking the cake, everybody is, watching TV in the other room. When it comes time to take the cake out of the oven and maybe see how it came out, you have a lot of, supporters. And that was the story of it. The majority of the American public was against Apollo the entire 60s and only came around after the successful landing. But that's politics at its best. Those people took the risk because they figured there'd be a payoff, and they got it. These are some of the missions that I worked on and some of the people. The next slide with me sitting next to a satellite. That was a satellite we built for Los Alamos Labs in about 1987. And the next picture, right to the right of that, in this big collage of satellites, is that satellite being launched out of the space shuttle. And that was one of those very exciting moments. And I was, it was a team of maybe 6 of us who built it. And me being the most travel inclined, being kind of like go any place, anytime, I just was always glad to do that. Got to go to Cape Canaveral, the civilian side of Cape Kennedy. The shuttle was standing on its rear end, 300 whatever it is feet in the air or however long it is, with a big gantry, open metal lattice with these construction type elevators like you're working on on a skyscraper in New York or something like that. And me, with the great phobia of heights, got on that elevator, very high up near the back window of the, where the crew goes, and physically bolted those. There were 3 copies of that satellite, physically bolted those 3 satellites into those 3 canisters that you see there, with the seagulls flying around and the wind. And I'll tell you, I was scared to death, but it was so totally worth it, to actually be there and actually touch that hardware and think, in a few weeks, this thing is going into orbit, and these satellites are going to be on their own. And it was, it was very exciting. The space business has that element to it. The next slide at the top is another satellite that we did for Los Alamos that was more of a scientific satellite. The first one was more of a DoD type satellite. We didn't really do it, for Los Alamos, we tested it at Los Alamos. But the second one, the one with the guy standing next to it in the clean room suit, was for science at Los Alamos with instrument package from Japan and another instrument package from France, and involved a lot of flying around the world to make that one happen. But it's a small satellite. I mean, the satellite itself, you really can't see what you're looking at. All the black boxes and everything are all the sensors. The satellite part is where the solar panels are screwed in. It's almost a parentheses in the design of the whole thing. Then that's me taking a slice off of Arthur Clarke's hair in Colombo, Sri Lanka, where he participated in a mission we never got to fly to launch human DNA into a Earth escape trajectory, to realize something he had written in one of his books about that we as humans couldn't migrate into the stars, but our DNA could. And so we were collecting customers' DNA, and for $35 or $50, you could have your DNA sample flown on an infinite trajectory into the stars. So I'm going to quit, I guess, even though I have a whole bunch of slides, and pick this up in another podcast just because we're already 21 minutes. I'm just thinking, how much more do I have? Yeah, a fair amount. It paid to hit the pause button and come back to you. So let me pause at this point. I'll just mention, you've seen the picture with the 4-5 students standing around the little, that's a model, of course, not a real satellite, but it was developed in this class, 176. Just below my picture is another satellite Aeroastro built for MIT. And I think I mentioned that one in class. All 3 of those guys are Brown students. And so we had a little Brown mafia going at the company, which it wasn't that we discriminated against non-Brown people, but we were kind of immigrants, and I was the first immigrant. And where did other immigrants come from? They're like your family, your friends. I got a job here, and there was Cuban immigrants in Cleveland, Ohio, when I was growing up there. And why did we have so many Cubans? Because a few came, and they sponsored their relatives, and their relatives got jobs, and they sponsored their relatives. And, that's what happened to Aeroastro. We were, 25 or 30% Brown people, because it was easy to draw from Brown. But next to those people on their right is the TDRS satellite, which was the first of 3 geosynchronous communication satellites that replaced the old system of ground stations that we used to have through NASA. NASA had 26 ground stations spread around the world. I remember one in Spain. And then when humans would be in orbit, we could talk to them because they would pass over one ground station after another. There was always this tense moment when we couldn't hear them anymore on the East Coast, and then we would pick them up in the Spanish ground station. That's why I remember that one in Spain. But, it was always discontinuous, low bandwidth, kind of crackly communications because they're moving from horizon to horizon as you see the orbit happening. And the antenna is tracking them, and sometimes, obstacles or an airplane gets in the way, it drops out for a second. I mean, it's not, it's not internet, right? It's like, Houston, we have a problem, beep. And then, a second later, the person on the ground says, yeah, tell me about it, beep. And, that wasn't going to move us into the 21st century. And NASA's concept was to put 3 satellites 120 degrees spaced around the equator that would point down and listen and provide a relay for space missions, for the space shuttle. It was originally, or Skylab, it was around that period of time. And when that happened, all of a sudden we had, like going from AM to FM, we had high quality audio, continuous, without breaks, highly predictable, video streams, everything you could want. And that system basically is the system that is still running today. So that, these are the pictures of students. The far lower left was a group of master's students that graduated. You can see me mixed in with them. And then a little bit more to the right is one of the projects from this class I should talk about one day, a project to hit the moon with a block of aluminum, 5 kilograms, at 20 kilometers per second to cause the ionization of some rocks on the surface of the moon and get some information about the composition of the lunar surface through spectroscopy. Okay, so let me go on to one more slide because it's still, that's okay. Let's quit there. I'll stop the recording and then we'll go on to podcast 2 in just, you can segue from one to the other. You can quit. Sometimes it's easier to have a new recording. Okay, see you shortly.